Hello, hello, everybody. I think we're live. I'm not entirely sure because it takes way too long to show as live. So I am here back again. Yeah, apparently I was live for some 15 seconds before Facebook showed me as live. I am not sure if anyone has joined me yet, so I'm going to wait before I go through my standard introductions. But we were talking about the first wave. Hey, Jay, so somebody's here. We're going to talk about the first wave abolitionist movement today. It's as always. I have goals. I have reasons. I've also been wearing a hat, so you have my hat head. Shake up my hair a little bit. Anyway, vanity. So, thanks, Jay. Um, so I'm waiting. We're gonna wait because I see only one person, one eyeball here so far. Oh, yeah. My hair's a mess. I'll get a haircut one day, my friends, I promise. And then I won't look like such a disheveled, rumpled professor. That said, I was talking to someone about this the other day, and the joke is almost that I cultivate the disheveled, rumpled professor look. And the lack of ironing on my clothes demonstrates that if you ever saw it. But of course, today I'm just wearing a t shirt. So we've got three people. Let's see, we'll wait till maybe five people before we begin. Or I'll wait 1 minute and then I'll begin my standard introduction and that'll allow people to come in. You've all heard it before, probably who are here now. So that way it'll give a place to enter into the topic of the day and as well for us to go through and say what's important to say. Hi, Cassandra. Yeah, I need to run a brush through my hair. Oh, this is like it's like a moving mirror. It's very troubling, but just a few more seconds and I'll start the standard and then we'll get into this because there's a great deal of material to cover today. Great deal of material. Uh, One of the benefits of this format, as opposed to when I teach standard history, is that when you teach standard history, you have to look at, say, 1776 and then cover everything that happened in 1776. Whereas here, I can cover an issue or a theme and cover the long span of it as it has occurred through history. So, a few more seconds, and we'll start the standard boilerplate introduction, which you all have heard before, and it'll give more people a chance to join us. And then we can get moving. So, anyway, let us begin formally. So, my name is Joe Solar. I have been doing these little video series kind of informally for almost 3 months now. My goodness. Okay. And I am going to tell you who I am because, as I always point out, we currently sit in a society where there is a great deal of misinformation that is being circulated, and there's an old cliched line that says a lie can travel around the world 5 times or 3 times or 4 times, whatever, in the time it takes for the truth to put its boots on. It sounds like a Mark Twain type thing, but I'm not sure. But anyway, so we always should consider the sources. We should always consider information being presented to us. I heard a radio story for someone about misinformation, and the person said the one way to really worry or to think with regards to information in the internet is how emotional does it make you feel. And if you see something that makes you feel powerfully emotional, whether powerfully outraged or powerfully sad or powerfully happy, take a deep breath, pause, and seek confirming evidence. And so I will present at the end of this a whole array of links of evidence for further reading and exploration so that those of you who are interested in this topic can explore it in greater depth and to establish credibility. As far as who I am an adjunct instructor at Rowan College of Burlington County and also at Alvernia University. I teach African American history and U.S. history, which is the same thing, except one is more narrowly focused, obviously. And I have been teaching for 5 years at that school, and it was one of my former students, Lauren, who asked me to work together and create this collaborative series so that more people can be exposed and learn about issues, facts, and relevant information as we sit in a country that is in one of those moments which occur from time to time, as we will see, where we consider racial injustice, racial inequity, as it has manifested in our society over the years. My PhD is from Temple University in urban education. It's where I got my master's as well. I did kind of multidisciplinary work in anthropology, sociology, and history there, and a little political science tossed in for good measure. Understanding educational policy. My undergraduate degree is from Harvard University, where I was incredibly lucky to study with just some of the most mind-blowing scholars in this country who taught me so much, which I hope that I pass on to you as effectively and passionately and transformatively as they did for me. So I'm not going to name drop today. Yeah, I'll name drop today. Credibility. So some of my professors were people like Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Kwame Anthony Appiah and Orlando Patterson and James Loran Mattori and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Jamaica Kincaid, just Werner Solars, you probably haven't heard of, but he's extraordinary. He's a German. I'm not sure if he's a U.S. citizen, but he was German, and he studied at the same school as Du Bois did, which interested in African American studies, and brought him to the U.S. But anyway, so let's get started. This is a deliberate, constructed. They're all deliberate and constructed. I'm talking about the first wave abolition movement. There's a couple reasons why I want to do this. One, because when we talk about, for example, feminism, it is pretty standard to talk about first wave feminism and second wave feminism and third wave feminism, as in that there was this role of different movements through American history pushing and advocating for women's equality. And we hear very often about the abolitionist movement. And when we say the abolitionist movement, it involves the people I was discussing last week, writing their slave narratives and having public meetings. People like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe and William Lloyd Garrison and Sojourner Truth and John Brown and Lewis Tappan, all these individuals. But it is incorrect to say that they were the abolitionist movement, because there was a prior, earlier abolitionist movement in colonial North America, which carried through into the early American Republic. And this first wave of the abolitionist movement enjoyed many successes, frankly, and also some failures. But what is notable for the sake of y'all, my audience, is that this first wave abolitionist movement was very heavily directed, centered in the Delaware Valley. And so we're going to hear some very familiar places today and familiar stories that relate to a lot of us who live here in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And then we'll talk about some of the successes and some of the failures. So to begin quickly, briefly, the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which has come under attack lately from the president for teaching the reality of slavery, anyway, teaches us that the British colonies brought enslaved people in 1619. And a few weeks ago, we talked about the British laws and the development of those laws. And what is notable is that in 1619, slavery as we understand it was not established. And in fact, there was a rough sort of bottom rung of the ladder equality between Africans and Europeans who were in this indentured servitude sort of nightmare. But we also saw that over the 1600s, over the span of those decades, increasingly there's a separation that occurs in the law between European indentured servants on the one hand and Africans on the other hand, that ultimately leads to what we call chattel slavery, in which indentured servants, Europeans, Christians in their parlance, would be designated as people who owe labor, and Africans are people who are wholly owned property of another human being and their children as well. And so, as this system is slowly, incrementally developing in these colonies, there are people who disagree with it. Now, one of the things that I always say when I teach this in my class is that we must recognize, when we talk about abolitionists, is that every single enslaved person is an abolitionist, right? Every single person who was breaking tools or pretending to be sick or running away, every single person living in slavery is an abolitionist, because he and she and they and all of them wanted their freedom. And so when we talk about the abolitionist movement or the abolitionists, we don't often talk about the enslaved people, but always keep it in the back of your mind that the abolitionists, as we discuss them, we're talking of people who are free, who are able to wield political power and political influence in society, and that legally speaking, part of understanding the slave resistance that I discussed last week or 2 weeks ago, is that enslaved people are always abolitionists and they're always resisting, but their legal status in society really, really makes it difficult for them to push for kind of a movement, if you will, except, of course, when they would engage in straight up violent rebellions. Nat Turner, etc. So, what is this first wave abolitionist movement? Well, it is notable. I was watching a video that I'll also link to. Actually, I'll put that one up there. According to this video, and it's from PBS, so it has some credibility, the very first time the term white appears in British law is in 1681, after the Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. And the Bacon's Rebellion united poor whites, poor Africans, and African Americans, and enslaved Africans and African Americans, because there are free people of color in Virginia in 1676. And so suddenly white appears in there. So it is around this time that legal scholars are beginning to write laws to separate the poor white and the poor black communities from each other, and to create and implement chattel slavery. Not coincidentally, but at the same time, there is a colony that is established in the Delaware Valley called Pennsylvania. And those of you who live in Western Jersey, which is a designation you might not have heard before, have to understand that Western Jersey was part of Pennsylvania. So if you live in anywhere along the Delaware River in New Jersey, that was part of William Penn's original land grant. And again, this land grant just means that he had the right to go settle, and that British power would be brought to back him up if he had troubles with the native population. So Pennsylvania is established. He plans the city of Philadelphia, and they begin building it. And the Penn family, as wealthy English aristocrats, are engaged in the slave trade, and they have enslaved people. The city of Philadelphia is a city whose foundations are built, in part at least, by enslaved people. And people begin to flock to the settlement because it is a settlement centered on religious liberty, which did not exist anywhere else in the world. In fact, remember Florida, they had racial equality, liberty, if you will, as long as you were Catholic. So it doesn't take long before the condition of those who are enslaved attracts attention. And in 1688, so only a few years after the founding of Pennsylvania, in 1688, a group of Germans who were Quakers and refugees from their own homeland in what is called, I know you've heard of it, Germantown. So Germantown, which is now part of Philadelphia, which wasn't back then, the Germantown Quakers, or these Germantown Quakers, approach the meeting house in what was Abington, but it was called Dublin back then, and they write a petition against slavery. And so in 1688, I mean, real early in American history, slavery has not even fully legally slammed down, and Germans in Philadelphia, which is already called, well, in Pennsylvania, in Germantown, are already petitioning against the institution of slavery. And their notion is that it's unjust and that it's unchristian because, of course, at the time in Europe, around the same time, the 1680s, the European powers were at war with Ottoman Turkey. And the Turks, this rising, terrifying Muslim Turkish power, would take Christians as slaves, which was in violation of old Islamic law in and of itself, which tells you that you can lay down the law, but it doesn't mean people will follow it. And so the petition centers around the injustice of slavery, how it makes people seem pretty much like property, how it breaks up families. 1688, remember, 1688. It breaks up families, and how it debases Christian faith by behaving like infidels. The petition doesn't go very far, and in part, it's because the English at this time are becoming very heavily invested in the transatlantic slave trade. And the English Quakers are themselves slave keepers, was the term then. You kept men as slaves, right? Even they recognized that no one is a slave. They are enslaved. And so they call them slave keepers because they keep people as slaves, because it's impossible for them to be actually slaves. The importance of language. And so Pennsylvania continues developing with enslaved labor, and the Jersey side as well. Over time, we see people in the 1700s becoming concerned about slavery, but it doesn't become a major issue. Except, of course, again, all of those who are enslaved, right? If you're enslaved, you want freedom. And so we know that there are runaways. There's always runaways, all the resistance, all those things that I discussed a couple weeks ago are occurring in Pennsylvania. They're occurring in New Jersey, right? They occur anywhere people are enslaved. People will try to resist, run away, break away, become free. And so that brings us, if you were looking at the page, to the picture of that guy that I posted. And his name is Benjamin Lay. He is, yes, Cassandra, money over morals. Benjamin Lay is a Quaker, and he is a little person. We're not entirely sure. I've kind of seen mixed accounts of this. Either he was a little person who suffered congenital dwarfism, or he was an individual who suffered extreme scoliosis, which restricted his height and his growth. So he was an individual who suffered physical torment and deformity, which potentially is what makes him into the person he becomes. He books passage as a trader and a merchant to the New World, and he lands in Barbados. And Barbados is the jewel of the crown of the British sugar industry. So that means that it is a massive sugar colony built on the backs of enslaved, toiling Africans. In Barbados, Benjamin Lay witnesses enslaved people and witnesses violence, and I believe he witnessed an auction. And Benjamin Lay, bearing witness to the suffering inflicted upon African people by his fellow Englishmen, turns on slavery at that moment. He's disgusted by his people. And he commits his life to combating slavery. He moves here to the Delaware Valley, to Philadelphia, and he spent some time living in Burlington as well. He is actually buried in the Abington Friends Cemetery in Abington, Pennsylvania, which is, of course, the meeting house where that Quaker petition of 1688 was first submitted. So it's something poetic about that. And when he arrives in the Delaware Valley, this land of his people, the Quakers, he is very disappointed and horrified to witness how many of his fellow Quakers actually are engaged in keeping people as slaves. And so he decides he wants to do something about it. And again, this is a story that I have heard different versions of, so bear with me. He decides to take his protest to the Burlington Friends meeting, which is today they actually had moved the meeting house. So the current Burlington Friends meeting house in Burlington City is not where this protest took place. The protest took place a few miles down the road during a time when the meeting house had moved. But nonetheless, it's Burlington, New Jersey, that will witness the first activist protest on record. Who knows? There might have been others we just didn't know about. Activist protest on record by a white person against slavery. And why do I include that qualification? Because obviously any enslaved person who runs away is engaged in activism against slavery. Oh, Barbados is finally going to become a republic. Good for them. Jay saying they're getting rid of the Queen as their figurehead. It's what Ireland did at one point too, to become a full republic. So Benjamin Lay wants to dramatize slavery or the conditions of slavery. And so he first talks about it in meeting because, of course, there is no clergy in the Quaker faith, but there are certain kind of first among equals among the Quakers, as they'll tell you if you go to the Burlington Meeting House. But anyone can speak, so he speaks about it, and it doesn't go anywhere. So finally he decides to be more dramatic and engage in a protest. And what he does, he gets himself a military uniform, because of course Quakers are pacifists, and he strides into the meeting house in his military uniform, but covered up by a coat, and he begins a speech denouncing the, I don't remember the specific term, but those first among equals, in other words, the wealthy leaders of the Quaker community in Burlington, for keeping slaves. And he declares that they are standing against God, and he throws off his coat, and he says, "This is what you are. You've become soldiers. You've become people of violence," which of course is antithetical to being a Quaker, and it is as if you are stabbing the Bible. And he then takes a Bible and impales it with a sword, and out of said Bible, blood pours all over the floor of the Quaker meeting house. So what this clever man did is he had taken kind of a bladder, if you will, like we would use a balloon today or something, and filled it with a red liquid, or maybe it was real blood. And then he shoved it into the Bible and shoved the sword in, and so it exploded and it bled all over the floor, and Benjamin Lay was shunned, and they were angry at him for protesting against their immoral behavior and denouncing their behavior of keeping slaves as immoral. He then, either again that day or other days, it's kind of unclear in the record, would sit in the snow or stand in the snow barefoot, freezing, and bearing witness to the sins of the Quakers as they came out of meeting in the middle of winter and things like that. And so he very much is committed to the anti-slavery cause. And in more than just words but deeds. And this is what makes him an activist. But again, he is English. So this is what makes him an ally. And, it's very easy to forget that there are allies and there are people who've done the right thing. And there are two reasons to understand or highlight this. One, because one of the easy kind of lazy apologetics we will hear from people regarding inhumane institutions like slavery or whatever is, well, that's just the way they did things back then. Or, well, they just didn't know any better back then. And it is true that we have become better than they were back then. But the existence of the 1688 petition, Benjamin Lay's activism in the 1730s, indicate that there were people making the moral arguments. And so those who, quote, didn't know better back then, it is not that they didn't know better. There were people making arguments in favor of equality and making arguments that demonstrated the hypocrisy of slavery, but people chose not to know better. And so you cannot make an excuse that they just didn't know better. These individuals had a choice, and they chose not to know better. Benjamin Lay will then draw up an entire treatise. What did he call it? He called it All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage, Apostates, Pretending to Lay Claim to the Pure and Holy Christian Religion. In other words, he wrote a book basically articulating his belief and his philosophy that slavery is completely against Christianity, and that those who profess Christianity while keeping people as slaves are actually apostates, which is a very, very, one heck of an accusation, because, of course, in most Christian traditions, the penalty for apostasy was death. Not the Quakers, of course, but he wrote this book. And what is notable is that Benjamin Lay, the activist, had this book printed in Philadelphia by a friend of his who happened at some point in his life to have kept slaves himself, named Benjamin Franklin. And so Benjamin Franklin prints Benjamin Lay's book in 1737, and it gets some circulation in the Delaware Valley. And it begins to move people. And among those moved is a Philadelphia Quaker named John Wohlmann, who is buried in Mount Holly, New Jersey. Like I said, it's all over our neighborhoods. And John Wohlmann becomes very interested, and again, I'll have links to all this stuff, becomes very interested in anti-slavery issues. He is actually born in Burlington and spent his early years at the Burlington Friends meeting, which means that he was a witness to Benjamin Lay's activism. And so, again, the records are still a little fuzzy, but according to Bryn Mawr, in the 1740s, Wohlmann would take a tour through kind of more slave-owning southern states, right? In other words, he witnessed slavery in New Jersey. He firsthand witnessed Benjamin Lay's activism, but he wasn't entirely sold, but it led him on an expedition to investigate this thing that his fellow Quaker had been complaining about. And Wohlmann's journeys through Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina turned him anti-slavery. And he published a pamphlet called Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes on Religious Grounds. He writes it, but he holds on to it. He doesn't quite publish it. He's worried. He's afraid. He doesn't have the courage of his convictions, basically. Meanwhile, Benjamin Lay is continuing with his activism. And Benjamin Lay, sorry, this is funny. Benjamin Lay, at one point, went to the home of one of the first among equal Quakers of the Burlington meeting, and he took the kids. Or he lured the kids. He did something with the kids. And he took them away from their parents. And when the parents freaked out that someone had kidnapped their children, he said, "Ah, now you understand the pain and the sadness that a parent feels when their children are taken from them. You now know what it is like to be an African whose children are taken from them by the institution of slavery." And then he gave the kids back. And so there is agitation in Philadelphia. There is activism in Philadelphia around this issue because Benjamin Lay is pushing this issue. And of course, and this is for any of you future historians out there, the record is very sparse in terms of free people of color living in Philly, which there were, and what they may or may not have been doing. I do know that Paul Cuffey, the individual from Massachusetts that I talked about, who's African and Wampanoag, and became involved in the colonization movement and friends with Fortin and whatnot, he was a Quaker. And so we know that by the 1750s, the Quaker, the Society of Friends, the Quakers are actively debating the morality of the keeping of enslaved people. And it's a significant issue and it's important to them. Wohlmann takes it a step further in that not only does he begin kind of writing and talking about slavery, he finally publishes in 1754 his text. And in 1755, the Philadelphia Friends meeting officially took a stand against slavery. And so the Philadelphia Quaker meeting basically said that any individuals who were part of the Philadelphia Quaker meeting would be censured by the community if they kept slaves. And so it's around 1755 that we can say the Philadelphia Quakers, who included, because it's the big, larger community, includes Burlington County, whatever, turn against the institution of slavery as a group. Not all Friends meeting because it's kind of decentralized. And so there will still be Quakers keeping slaves, even in the 1750s in this region. But in parts of the Carolinas and Virginia, other places where there are Quakers, there'll still be some keeping slaves. But nonetheless, the Philadelphia meeting of the Society of Friends is officially against slavery, and all participating members of that meeting, so Abington, Burlington, etc., Germantown, are now anti-slavery officially. And Wohlmann organizes what, in a sense, is the first boycott on behalf of enslaved people, trying to organize his collaborators to refuse to purchase goods produced by enslaved labor. So it's the 1750s and 1760s, before the Revolution, before the Sons of Liberty engage in their boycotts of English tea and whatever, and John Wohlmann is already leading boycotts of goods produced with slave labor to try to put pressure and to hit enslavers in their pocketbooks. And he does help to kind of turn the tide. I don't have the specific year, but eventually Benjamin Franklin would free the 4 out of 5 remaining people who he had enslaved because one of his had run away. And Benjamin Franklin will become an abolitionist. But what is noteworthy about this is that even before the colonies are beginning to agitate for liberty from the British, there are already colonists agitating for liberty for the enslaved. So the abolitionist movement in what is now the United States predates the revolutionary movement that establishes the United States. And when you look at these two things side by side, and you look at American Revolutionary War history, it is worthwhile to note, exactly, it is worthwhile to note, I'll answer your question in a second, Cassandra, about Wohlmann. It's worthwhile to note that all of the discussions about liberty during the Revolution did not occur independent of the discussion of liberty for the enslaved. But these were the same arguments. And what does liberty mean? And so when people like Fortin and whatnot come after the Revolution, Richard Allen, as activists for liberty, yeah, I'm looking at yeah, he was a traveler, John Wohlmann, sorry. I'll send you more information on him so you can read up on him. And it's Wohlmann like wool clothes or wool on sheep, Cassandra. So not only do we clearly have this liberty discussion in the context of the Revolutionary War discussion, but it's gaining traction. A French Protestant named Anthony Benezet, who moves to Philadelphia as a consequence of religious oppression in France, is one of Wohlmann's converts to the abolitionist cause. I'm still not entirely clear if Benezet ever became a Quaker formally, but he definitely hung out with Quakers. But he was a Huguenot. And so these French Protestants who settle in Philadelphia, Anthony Benezet begins speaking out and writing against slavery. And more effectively, Wohlmann's leading boycotts, Benezet is speaking out. Benezet opens up a school for black children in Philadelphia. And part of why this is important is that public education didn't exist in Philadelphia, and education schools emerged related to church organizations. And churches in Philadelphia were ethnically and religiously segregated, right? So the Scottish Presbyterians had their church, the English Catholics had their church, the Irish Catholics had their church, the High Church Anglicans Church of England had their church, etc. The Germans had theirs. You get the idea. But for those of you who remember Richard Allen, there was no black church. There was no African Methodist Episcopal Church yet. And that meant that there was no formal African organization or African American organization to create a school. And so Benezet filled the gap and created a school for black children, which helped improve literacy and education in the black community in Philadelphia. And so what does all of this starting to come together mean? What it means is there is an abolitionist movement in Philadelphia, and there are steps and actions being taken that are improving the quality of life for Africans and African American people in the city. That people are trying to fight this issue and make it about liberty, broadly speaking, and to influence fellow Quakers and fellow Philadelphians against slavery in general, which was still part of Pennsylvania law. What is most important in the context of this first wave abolitionist movement is that John Wohlmann's writings cross back into England. And John Wohlmann helped seed the English abolitionist movement. And why this matters is for many reasons, in the long span, for many reasons. The first is that it's the English abolitionists who established the colony, eventually the Republic of Sierra Leone. It is the English abolitionists who will abolish the slave trade unilaterally, but at the time when England's navy ruled the world and could enforce it. And it's the English abolitionists who will lead the English to abolish slavery throughout the entire British Empire 30 years before the United States abolishes slavery, and 60 years before the Brazilians do. And so this English abolitionist movement begins in large part because Englishmen are moved to the cause of abolition by a guy from Burlington. Allyship. English abolitionists play host to Frederick Douglass when he has to flee the country after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. English abolitionists help thwart English entry into the Civil War on behalf of the Southern side. And so all of these long-term consequences get seeded in the 1750s and 60s from here. But we also see in England in 1772 the first court case against slavery. And it's called the Somerset Case. Wrong one. Boop. I'll send you the link. It's called the Somerset Case. There we go. And it's brought in England by an enslaved man. And what it basically argues is that slavery and owning people is illegal, and that we can own a person's labor under indenture, but that doesn't mean owning people. And it's the case of James Somerset, who was considered the property of a Boston area enslaver. And Somerset escaped and made it to England, where he sued for freedom. And Granville Sharp, who was Lord Mansfield in England, Granville Sharp had become a staunch abolitionist because of reading John Woolman's books. And so he took up the Somerset Case and financed the Somerset Case. And in the end, the ruling was that a person could not be enslaved in England. And this is very legally hair-splitting, but nonetheless, steps forward are steps forward, even if they're little baby steps. In other words, slavery was legal in England, so that if I was an enslaver and brought my enslaved people with me to England, that was fine. But see, Somerset had escaped from slavery, and by escaping, he was free. And since he was free in England, he then could not be turned into a slave. His status couldn't be changed to slavery because England is a land of liberty. And it is one of the very first major English cases in this era where an enslaved person is able to sue and win freedom. And Somerset is freed. And this is right in the 1770s when the colonists are agitating for their freedom and their independence. And just to put a short on it, understand that the American Revolution, for all the issues that you've no doubt learned about over the years, the American Revolution is about slavery. The enslavers will use the language of slavery and of liberty in their struggle against the British. The British will use enslaved people's desire for freedom against the colonists. And the war will turn and hinge in many parts and in many places on the issue of slavery. As we know, in the end, it's wins and slavery's, or the revolution's over. The Americans win their independence in 1783, but slavery is still very much on the agenda, and it is still a very live issue, and the abolitionists are still active. And again, this is huge and important. Forten is coming of age in this time period. James Forten, the very, very prominent, wealthy black Philadelphia sailmaker. Cuffy, Paul Cuffey is already of age and building his wealth. There are free people of color who are making it. And their voices are not ignored. Richard Allen is coming of age in this period. And so these men who we know of, these black voices for freedom and liberty, part of what helps empower them is that they are not voices in the wilderness, right? It's an unfair reality, but in a society that was majority and dominantly English, voices that weren't English were not considered important unless the English validated them, right? In other words, those little front pages of the slave narratives that are like, we swear, we read this guy, and we blah, 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 right? And so allies, allyship, white allies help create the spaces for black activism against slavery. James Forten gets an education in Philadelphia because there are black schools created by people like Benezet and then his fellow travelers, if you will, on the road of abolitionism. And so we see the seeding of activism and the seeding of success. In 1784, so after the Revolution, there was this kind of question about what to do with the Northwest, the old Northwest territories that the British had conceded belonged to the United States, so the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois. And the Continental Congress decreed that those territories would be free of slavery. So no slavery. So the state of Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and Michigan will be states in which slavery never legally existed. But more kind of hopefully, because the revolution is about slavery, we begin to see the state constitutions of these newly independent colonies, states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, well, not New York yet, Rhode Island, Vermont, that are written and specifically create a mechanism for the abolition of slavery, right? Pennsylvania in 1780 will write a new constitution. They write two. That's a whole nother story. But the 1780 Pennsylvania Constitution calls for the gradual ending of the institution of slavery in Pennsylvania. It's the first constitution to do so. When the state of Vermont is created by rebels who break away from New York, one of the first things they do in the Vermont Constitution is outlaw slavery. Connecticut will outlaw slavery. Massachusetts will create a kind of very vague in-between status which will enable enslaved people to sue for their freedom, similar to the Somerset Case. And the very first of these is a woman named Mumbet, who sues for freedom under the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, arguing that... Sorry, the Pennsylvania Constitution was 1778. I apologize. 1780s Massachusetts. Arguing that the Massachusetts Constitution guarantees liberty. It never said anything about slavery, it just said liberty, and that all people are equal. And she wins her case. And then other enslaved people in Massachusetts begin suing for freedom, and they win their cases. And eventually Massachusetts just throws up their hands and they're like, slavery is done. Rhode Island, which was the major slave port of the North, Newport, Rhode Island, all those mansions built on slave money, abolishes slavery after first enlisting thousands of enslaved Rhode Islanders as soldiers in their revolutionary conflict, right? So when we think about the divide between the free states and the slave states, right, in American history, that classic divide, it didn't just happen. It wasn't magic. What happened was groups of abolitionists, white abolitionists, begin agitating with their fellow whites to show them the error of their ways in keeping Africans as property, in keeping Africans as slaves. And not only do those white allies help to shape the laws around slavery, they help shape the discourse that will influence the later abolitionist movement. And they achieve successes because these various new states will be created without slavery because of their actions. And because of their actions, because of their support for African and African American people, they create spaces for African and African American people to grab their piece of the American pie and to help expand that pie ever larger. James Forten is born free in Philadelphia, but he goes to Benezet's school to learn how to read and become more highly educated, and then becomes one of the great business tycoons in early American history. Right? So you have this expansive, multiracial, multi-ethnic cooperation occurring despite the attempts to separate and divide people. In 1800, New York abolishes slavery. Took a little longer in New York because they were much more invested. And then in 1804, New Jersey abolishes slavery. It took them the longest because they were the most invested, right? It might be the Garden State, but those gardens weren't tended by free people. But when you look at it on the whole, the reason why there is a, quote, free North is because of the work of these abolitionists and what they achieved and what they did and their willingness to view African people as their equals. The Quakers slowly but surely get rid of all the slave-keeping Quakers among them. And so what does that mean? It means that there is a religious movement in the United States that is a dissident anti-slavery movement. And when the time comes, decades later, for an underground railroad to help smuggle people to freedom, enslaved Africans knew that if they could find Quakers, they could find allies. And William Garrett, who's from Drexel Hill, right here just outside Philly, he will move to Wilmington in the middle of slave country to help conduct people to freedom. And his most famous passenger and later collaborator in the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman. And so these people, these ideas, this is a generational legacy that begins far earlier than we generally know the story of. It begins far earlier and it achieves far more than we think of. And it is important because they do not just wake up one day. It takes instigators, it takes activists, it takes persuasion, it takes boycotts, it takes civil disobedience. Just to give you an example of more of the civil disobedience, once the Quakers were fully anti-slavery, or mostly anti-slavery, in Philadelphia, they would go to the slave auctions down at Front and Market Street, or Front and High, it was called back then, and they would purchase enslaved people and then free them on the spot in front of everybody else, disrupting the entire proceedings. And so the Philadelphia government became quite concerned and tried to rope in the Quakers. Not only that, in the very first meeting of the very first Congress of the United States, 1789 to 1791, the first Congress, the Philadelphia branch of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, because yes, they created institutions for abolishing slavery, drew up a petition similar to the Germantown petition of 100 years earlier. And Benjamin Franklin signed it. And they sent this petition to the U.S. Congress calling for an immediate abolition of slavery throughout the United States. 1791. So the issue of abolition, the issue of the true, deeper meaning of liberty, the issue of the true, expansive interpretation of human equality. All men are created equal, whether African, European, or Native, are issues which Americans were deeply engaged. I see what you're saying, Jay. Once things get massively disrupted, there's these avenues for change. It's the revolution helped create a half-free society in the U.S., right? It created half-equal society in the U.S., in that Africans are people in American reckoning, but not, well, maybe, sort of, I don't know. But it is, again, also noteworthy, and I mentioned this maybe last week, the week before, is that under that spirit of equality, the Constitution of the United States guaranteed voting rights to all male property owners 21 years of age. And that meant African American property owners. So in the 1790s and early 1800s, African American men who own property are equal voters in American society. And so it's only later that the United States chooses to strip away rights from African Americans. And they literally have to take them away. And it's no coincidence that the same decade when the states are moving to strip African American voting rights, the 1830s, is the same decade that Congress, under Speaker of the House Polk, issues a gag rule which forbids Congress from taking up anti-slavery petitions. And so what that means, again, a story of decades, is that in 1790s and early 1801 to 1810, 1810 to 1820, etc., African Americans had citizenship rights to a greater degree than they would have in the years more directly close to the Civil War. And in fact, these restrictions on African American civil rights that are placed in the 1830s, it's tough to say either they were motivated by the second wave of the abolition movement or they helped pour gasoline on the fire of freedom that motivated the second wave of the abolitionist movement. But the reality is this: the issue of slavery in the United States was always an issue. That from implementing and restricting and stripping away rights from enslaved Africans and African Americans in Virginia in the 1600s, through a petition in Germantown in 1688, through to a little person named Benjamin Lay stabbing a Bible on the floor of the Burlington Friends meeting, to a John Wohlmann traveling the South to gather evidence and persuade the British to turn against slavery, to Benezet opening schools that educate the first generation of black leadership in the United States. We have a movement against slavery that is putting all the issues, the realities, and the philosophical arguments on the table decades before the United States would finally make the right decision and put themselves on the side of humanity and abolish slavery. And it is the absolute truth that this would not have happened except for the work and the activism of white allies who saw in black faces themselves, who saw human equality in all people, and who not only worked to free their fellow human beings, but worked to empower their fellow human beings so that by the time of the second wave abolitionist movement, there was a large, educated population of free people of color who were able to lead and fight their own movement. in the halls of Congress and state houses throughout the United States. It is the sort of multiracial, multi-ethnic, whatever you want to call it, cooperation between people that has always been the possibility and the promise of the United States. And like Jay says, there's a new wave of abolition occurring right now, and Cassandra's saying about allies, right? The allies were not part of the majority, Cassandra. They never were. In fact, it's one of these important facts based on Cassandra, your question about the allies and the majority, that abolitionists, white abolitionists, were always a minority. And because they were a minority of the white population, they had to be activists and agitators because they couldn't just talk or outvote the pro-slavery crowd. They had to move, stir, agitate, and create problems for enslavers, for rights. But it is so important to me to get this story out there because this country has always had that promise of cooperation. And we've seen that cooperation between people always. It has not occurred as much as it should and could have, obviously, or we would be much further along. But it has always been there. And when we feel hopeless or unheard or unseen, we should always know that there are always people out there who are willing to fight for others, as well as assist those who are fighting for themselves. All right. If anyone has any questions for me, I have lots of links to post up, tons of links. The Somerset Case, Granville, the Quaker Petition, Benjamin Lay's book, etc. Tons and tons of things. But we're in that place. So I'll wait about a minute for questions, and then I will call it an afternoon and start posting all these links so you can read up on these more interesting cases and read up on white allies and what they did, and also learn about some stuff going on in your backyard. Good question, Cassandra. Allies did not benefit from the business of slavery. Cassandra says, interestingly enough, in South Carolina during the American Revolution, there is a South Carolina militia colonel named John Laurens. His daddy, Henry Laurens, was the largest slave trader in South Carolina and one of the wealthiest men in America. And John Laurens, son of a wealthy slave trading family, was an ardent and strident abolitionist who spoke out on behalf of human freedom, and it was constantly petitioning and trying to fight for the colony or the state of South Carolina to free enslaved people and enlist them in the Continental Army to fight the War of Independence. So there is at least one guy who benefited and profited spectacularly from the slave trade, who considered it immoral. State of Rhode Island as well was run by the Newport traders. That's why the colony is called Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And they recognized that their fight for liberty could not be won without granting liberty to the people they'd been enslaving. And so they abolished slavery and enlisted. And yes, Jay, there is so much occurring all the time today. And I mean, it just gets right to the core of why Lauren and I work to do this, because it's important to know our history. So important to know our history. But as much as we can see and look at the the shameful acts of our history, the things that are disappointing in our nation that we need to look at. We can't ignore the things just because they make us uncomfortable. We also can look into that same history and find the hope, right? Find the sense that in the past there have been people who knew already what was right and who put themselves on the line for it, even if it wasn't directly impactful of themselves, right? Benjamin Lay was from a slave trading family himself, but Benjamin Lay, slavery didn't impact his life. He neither profited from it nor did he suffer from it, but he spent his entire lifetime in this region, which unfortunately was a shortened life because of his disability, fighting. Yeah. There are a lot of allies worth learning about. And some of these allies, they're not as great allies as you'd hope. People are flawed. But nonetheless, I think it matters because I think it's important for African Americans to know that they're not on their own. African Americans are not alone in this. And allies are there. Allyship sometimes needs a little work. People need to learn how to be good allies or better allies. But nonetheless, it's possible, and we have fought. And we have fought together on many occasions for the right thing, simply because it's the right thing to do. Yeah. And it's also fun, I think, because, we're here in the Delaware Valley, and I think very few people are aware of the kind of deep, rich, moral history of abolitionism in this area, right? When we hear about abolitionism, when we hear about the second wave, we hear about like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and these folks up in Massachusetts. But just like Boston doesn't deserve all the credit for the revolution, neither does it deserve all the credit for abolitionism. It shares a lot of that with those of us down here. There's also a guy named Lewis Tappan, Tappan, like the Tappan Zee Bridge, who was a white guy and an abolitionist in the 1820s who suffered for it. His house was burned to the ground by people who were mad at him for agitating for freedom. And he helped lobby New York to kind of cut their gradual abolition and just end slavery completely in 1828. So there are people who will do the right thing. There are people who will stand together for the right thing and for freedom. And we need to know it. And we need to keep all of the complexities of it together. But yeah, you can go to the John Wohlmann house. I'll provide the link up there later in Mount Holly. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. Yeah, that's right. And you can vote. And hopefully make change in our society and make our society a healthier, non-pandemic-y, more just, racially equal, gender equal, sexuality equal, human equal society. All right. I'm going to get going. This has been a long one. Look for those links, particularly if you want to, you can just take a drive in your own backyard and see some cool stuff. I still haven't been to Benjamin Lay's grave out in Abington, but I want to go one day just because I talk about him so much. And I just only recently learned last year that he was buried there. So anyway, and those of you in Burlington County, go check out the Burlington Friends meeting. They have the stories of Benjamin Lay and the anti-slavery agitation there. And they also admit that they had members who were engaged in keeping people as slaves and who, needed to be beaten into the right place. Beaten metaphorically, of course, because Quakers are nonviolent. Beaten through activism and through appeals to their souls. All right. Have a great day. Look for all the links. They'll be in the comments here, comment section momentarily. All righty. Have a great time. Enjoy the day. Keep everything in mind. I'm not sure what'll be up next week, but we'll be there, or we'll be here, I guess, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care now. Bye.